I think I'm going to get started, given that this is a sort of a lunchtime format and people may have things straight after lunch. So I'm Elspeth, I'm Dr. Elspeth Van Buren, and I'm an associate professor in the School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies at the University of Bristol. But I'm also a member of the steering group of SPIN, the Secrecy, Power and Ignorance Research Network, a multidisciplinary research network based in the southwest of the UK that specializes in understanding the work of secrecy and ignorance at all levels, and with broad sets of interests that span everything from stowaways to the invisibility of bisexuality, to magic, to the politics of secret agencies, all based around this idea of trying to understand the power and politics and social dimensions of unknowing. So this afternoon, I'm delighted to welcome you to the next event in our series funded by and co-hosted with the Southwest Doctoral Training Partnership. Over this 18-month period, we're working to deliver a series of lectures, panels, workshops on the theme of secrecy and ignorance in order to support the development of this exciting line of research. Today, we're welcoming Dr. Brett Edwards from the University of Bath to learn more about his work on the history of chemical weapons, including poisons, as well as his experience developing a podcast series on the subject. Dr. Edwards has a wide range of interests in the interface of technology, governance, and security. He is currently involved in a number of projects examining the security implications of cutting-edge biotechnology, the governance of biological and chemical weapons, as well as humanitarian interventions. He has also published on international responses to chemical weapons use in Syria. So through this work, he explores the processes through which norms, values, and authority are reproduced and contested, especially in the definition of technical problems. So we're therefore delighted to welcome you, Brett. We'll give you a chance to talk for over, so about 20, 30 minutes, after which we'll have a question and answer session, a general conversation, both about your research as well about your practice of podcasting. Over to you.
Great stuff, thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. So this is the first challenge. Here we go. Great, so you should be able to see that now. Is that correct?
Yep, we can see it, you're good.
Great stuff. Well, thank you so much for having me to speak today. It's always a bit of a difficult decision to work out how best to do a kind of introductory talk on this. So what I'm going to do is commit probably one of the biggest sins and try and attempt a 15-minute whistle-stop tour of the entire history of chemical and biological weapons and warfare. It will be completely incomplete and partial, but hopefully it will give you a sense of what I do on the show. And also, I'm hoping that, people will have different areas of interest and expertise. And so it will hopefully give them a way in to ask questions about this broader history. So just to start out, I thought I'd give you a picture of my setup. It's all acquired on Amazon, and it was all very cheap because I am tight, and also I didn't want anyone to pay for anything because it's easier if these things are done, I think, on your own budget. So basically, I run a show. We have regular episodes which kind of involve a slow trundle through the history of chemical and biological weapons and warfare, starting way back about 70,000 years ago, and also I run a series of specials where I get experts and practitioners and all sorts of people to come in and talk about their area of interest. Sometimes it is biographical, sometimes it's more kind of historical. It just depends. And generally speaking, what seems to be a kind of common theme with the people I have on the show is that they tend to have very sustained interest in an issue, which often seems to go beyond kind of professional commitments. They often are quite interested in history or in some technical aspects. In terms of audio base, surprisingly, this podcast, which I set up as something which was very niche and essentially a way of keeping me honest and keeping me producing stuff, got picked up quite broadly. And so I have quite a few people who just kind of got general interest in the show. But then there's also a kind of hub of other people who are either practitioners or experts in the area who listen, often because it covers stuff that's quite kind of niche even for them. And it's also a way of them brushing up on some of the broader historical issues, which often they touch upon in talks they give and those sorts of things. So, as I said, the whistle-stop tour I'm about to give is completely incomplete and completely partial, but hopefully it gives you a sense of the scope of the show. And in particular, it shows how in the show I'm trying to capture the kind of broader historical context of the evolution of chemical and biological weapons. It's kind of, I guess, in the bracket of kind of total history, and where the aim is to be as kind of holistic as possible, which means that sometimes you go off on tangents. It means there's often incoherence and things that really relate to each other very clearly because it's historical, it's messy. But what I do try and do is to kind of trace the history of this very niche aspect of warfare and conflict as far back as we can go, all the way up to the present day. And that's what I'm going to do for the next 10 or 15 minutes or so. So we start a fair way back. There is evidence of poison arrow use, which is difficult to distinguish in terms of whether it's for hunting or warfare, which goes back to at least 70,000 years, with physical artifacts being tested for chemical weapons, which stretch back to about 2,500 years, but work looking at arrowheads. Even though they can't often detect the poison, the shape of these arrowheads suggests that they were utilized with poison tips. In this prehistoric period, of course, we assume interchangeability, and we assume that weapons were used for hunting and warfare. And this is something which seems to be confirmed when we look at the histories of some of the largest city-state civilizations, which pushed out many of these peoples from certain parts of Europe, Africa, and Asia. They utilized poisons that were lying around. So this is things like aconite, and basically many of these poison uses continued up until the kind of 19th century in many kind of more isolated peoples. The Greeks, if you pick up Greek history, poison features very prominently in their myths, as do poison arrows. And this may in part reflect the kind of history of poison arrow hunting within the kind of predated the emergence of the city-states, as well as exposure to more nomadic peoples on their borders. Of course, we have to be very careful handling Greek mythology. It's not exactly, written or conceived to be a kind of accurate history. It's very tempting to fall into that trap. But certainly it gives us clues of the kind of relationships and mythologies of poison in those kind of eras. And the best work on this, of course, is by the author Adrian Mayer. Now, going back into the ancient world, we only really have myths and occasionally written legends, which we find in cuneiform tablets, for example. But to be frank, there's very little to go on. It seems reasonable to believe that occasionally poison arrows were used, that occasionally there may have been examples where things like water supplies were poisoned. However, there's certainly no concrete evidence of these practices. Very often, the first kind of example of chemical warfare, which is kind of referred to in the kind of potted histories, is that of the siege of Carrhae in the 6th century BC. Now, we're not sure the siege actually happened. We're not even so we certainly aren't sure if this poisoning claim is true. The claim is that the city was besieged, the water supply in the city was poisoned with hellebore flowers. Unfortunately, the myth seems to come from at least 200 years after the event, and probably even later than that, and may very well be an example of propaganda which was utilized in a war that followed several years later. Being that as it may, many stories and mythological versions of the siege of Carrhae and the poisoning of this city's water supplies kind of still appear, and still kind of appear particularly in kind of histories of chemical and biological warfare. It seems in this era, the histories kind of are much more interested in the stories don't die because they're interesting stories, and it has very little to do with the evidential base for them. Another interesting character which appears from this period is the Poison King, Mithridates, who was an enemy of Rome and had a real bizarre interest in poisons. He kept very, very detailed notes listing lots of different types of poison. He himself was terrified of being poisoned by his enemies. And much of his personal library, when it was captured, moved to Rome. And in this, there's some really bizarre work. Some of it looks at kind of poisons for assassinations. Other work looks at searches for antidotes. And there's also lots of strange claims about poisoned duck meat and those sorts of things. Haven't got time to go into them today. The book is there. It's excellent. The point is that poisoning seemed to fascinate certain individuals and also seemed to be part and parcel of realpolitik as far back as this period. The Romans engaged in water warfare. Frontinus reads half like a kind of tanky nerd, half like a kind of sage, and some of it, to be frank, is just either meant to be humorous or bonkers. One of the claims he makes is that when retreating, armies should burn all the trees but leave the cows and cattle alive, so that the invading army that comes behind have to eat raw meat and so succumb to various gastric diseases. That's just one example of the type of claim he makes about how potentially you could utilize poison or disease. Of course, we're very limited in terms of the evidential base, and to be frank, understanding of poison and disease was such in this period that even if this did reflect practice, it's questionable if we can really consider it examples of chemical or biological warfare. Frankly, to put it clear, because the methods of spread of disease and poisoning were so poorly understood, the strategies and tactics would have been quite crude anyway. One of the more interesting examples, however, which we do potentially have physical evidence for, comes from the siege of Europus in 256 AD. In this case, during a siege, there was underground mine warfare, and there is physical evidence that there may have been the use of smoke to flush out and kill adversaries as part of that conflict. We can be sure of this because of the way the mines collapse. We almost have a time capsule through which we can unpack day by day of a given battle. The use of smoke to harass or to even kill, then, it not only is potentially referred to in the works of people like Frontinus, but there may also yet to be further evidence revealed that smoke was a common part of warfare in that era. So what I think is interesting is that it's at this period we start to get the potential of real archaeological evidence beyond that of poison arrowheads. The most famous incident is the Siege of Kafar in 1346, in which supposedly Mongol invaders catapulted plagued corpses into the city, thereby causing a spread of the Black Death into Europe. Now, we think that actually what happened was that the invaders did bring the plague with them, but actually it was brought in the rats, and the rats moved into the city they were besieging, and that's how the plague spread. However, despite that, you'll still see reference to this idea that the plague entered Europe on the bodies of dead Mongol soldiers. Again, another example of a story that's simply too good to die. The idea that soldiers were used, the dead soldiers were used, actually comes from a contemporary source. However, yet again, the problem is the person commenting, the commentator where this claim comes from, didn't understand how disease works. And so it's very much us making contemporary inferences about what they might have meant. And also based on this problem that very often we struggle to distinguish between which parts of a story are kind of added for rhetorical effect and which parts might reflect an accurate depiction of what happened. Another area which is underexplored and in some respects is comparable to what we saw in relation to the Roman and Greek frontiers, where they were dealing with nomadic peoples, are claims that conquistadors and other invading forces faced the use of poison arrows against them during the 13th and 14th and 15th centuries. Now, this is an area that I'm starting to look into to see where these claims come from and to see what the evidential base of that is. Fast forward, we get into the American Civil Revolutionary War and Civil Wars and Wars of Independence. And here is where we start to see, towards the end of the 19th century, the rise of chemical production, but in relation to explosives, but also in relation to kind of more civilian things. And it's during this period we start to see early discussions of the potential of the use of things like tear gases as irritants and other toxic chemicals such as chlorine. There's limited evidence that these things were actually ever used, and they certainly weren't used in a systematic way. But it's interesting that it's in the early 19th century that we start to see the kind of antecedents of the industrialized use of chemical warfare that we would see in the First World War. For example, this is an image here which comes from one of the exhibitions of 1862, and you see here a discussion of a phosphorus illumination shell. Now, phosphorus is an illumination shell, or to produce smoke, would not be classed as a chemical weapon. But during this period, it is clear that several different arsenals were experimenting with filling shells with various compounds, including those that were potentially toxic. And again, that's another area that I'm going to be exploring in coming months. We then fast forward to the First World War. Of course, most people are most familiar with this, with a large systematic use of chemical weapons, the development of modern doctrines of chemical warfare, and the development of agents such most notably as mustard. In the interwar period, we saw not only the continued use of chemical weapons on a significant scale, particularly by imperial powers to quell unrest, but we also saw attempts to codify a global norm against these weapon systems, most notably the Geneva Convention of 1925. The Second World War, everyone thinks of the gas masks. What's interesting to note is that not only did we see widespread use of chemical and biological weapons in Manchuria in the East, but the West is often remembered as conforming to some form of normative prohibition on chemical and biological weapons. In reality, we perhaps came closer to use in that war than most people realized. And it's at the moment, I've been looking at, for example, the UK's deterrent capabilities in the areas of mustard and the planned use by the UK, for example, of mustard against German cities should the Germans have utilized chemical weapons or else invaded. After the Second World War, what we saw was the most significant investment into both chemical and then later biological weapons. Initially, these were primarily focused on providing a deterrent which could counter the threat of nuclear weapons, for example, in the UK. But later on, we saw a broadening investment into chemical and biological weapons for a range of tactical and strategic purposes. And this saw then substantial expansion of Western and Russian, in particular, defense military infrastructure. This was the area in which we saw things like human trials, because states were testing out and developing a range of offensive agents, notably nerve agents. All this then occurred in the context of the 1960s and 70s, where you then saw the first major public pushback against the use of chemical weapons. This then links to the use, for example, of Agent Orange and other defoliants in the Vietnam War. For those of you living around Bristol, it's the history of Porton Down in this area is particularly interesting. Porton was leading the UK's offensive and defence, the ideas of offence and offence were blurred in this period, but was leading the UK's CBW capability development. And so Porton very quickly became the centre of oppositional actions to block UK's development of chemical and biological weapons. In one of the specials I have in the show, you can see Mike Kenner, who is an open information campaigner, does an interview with me where we go through and look at some of the open air trials carried out in the Southwest, utilizing biological and chemical weapons simulants, something that we've often forgotten about and something that continues to raise kind of unsettled ethical questions. In 1972, we saw the attempt came to fruition to negotiate the Biological Weapons Convention. This was tightly linked with attempts to also agree a Chemical Weapons Prohibition Convention. This was obviously a good thing. However, problematically, it also became a motivator for Russia to expand its biological capacity. And this is epitomized in the anthrax leak of Slavnost, which is due a special comparable to that of the Chernobyl incident. This was a large military weaponized weapon anthrax leak, which killed many people, and what became deeply embroiled in the propaganda war during that period. Following this period, we of course saw the Iraq and Iran war, where we saw chemical weapon use systematically by the Iraqis against both the military and civilians. This built pressure towards the 1993 Chemical Weapons Convention, which is a global prohibition regime tasked with overseeing the destruction of chemical weapons and verifying that states are no longer producing such weapons. After this, however, certain grey areas continue to be of interest, most notably the use of agents designed as to incapacitate people. The Moscow theatre siege of 2002, for example, we saw the use of opiate agents to break a siege, but this killed over 100 of the hostages. Most people, of course, now, this is the history they're familiar with. 2003, we saw discussion of WMDs and the disagreements on the extent to which Iraq maintained its capacity. Then into the 2010s, in Syria, we of course saw nerve agent use, the systematic use of chlorine associated with a sustained and significant propaganda and disinformation campaign around Syria's troubled membership to the OPCW. And then this then takes us to the two tourists who visited Salisbury in 2018. And sadly, most recently, emerging themes which seem to be playing out in relation to the Ukrainian conflict. The first is the fact that, the vehicles here, by the way, are CBRN detection vehicles, which is not in itself something that we should worry about too much. But from my perspective, one issue that is not getting much attention, but we should perhaps be talking about, would be the potential use of tear gas and other agents by Russian security forces as part of so-called peacekeeping or riot control activities. It's worth noting that some of the convoys that have been ambushed by Ukrainian forces, within those convoys are policing riot control equipment. And so this may be a dimension of this conflict which sadly may open up and reopen questions about the use of tear gases and other agents in such contested contexts. The other aspect is disinformation around Western biolabs in Ukraine. It's complete hokum. However, that doesn't seem to matter too much. And so there's been a long-standing kind of propaganda campaign by Russia against the existence of these labs, which has basically become, linked to this narrative that somehow the Ukrainians are developing WMD, which is nonsense. However, this, I think, we will see will become another talking point in coming years. Now, that history is really broad, and what I found really fascinating is that you can trace the idea of poisons and disease a long way back, but the world has changed around these physical artifacts on one level. So understanding of disease has changed, the nature and character of warfare has evolved. At the same time, these are a modern weapon system. So it's not until the kind of early 20th century that you see advances in science and technology leading to the development of industrial scale scientific weapon systems, which then take them away from the traditional kind of more improvised use of poison and disease, even as aspects of projectiles and things like poison arrows. What's clear to me is that sadly, in every major historical era, we have seen the development and use of chemical and biological weapons. Now, don't get me wrong, they've always been niche and they've always been weird. But what is clear is that it would be naive to think that this is going to, that the use of these agents completely will ever die out. And sadly, it's certain developments in science and technology, and also in the character of warfare, seem to suggest that there will be new niches that will continue to open up for these weapon systems in coming decades. And that's all for me from that whistle-stop tour. I'm happy to take questions about either content or the podcast process.
That's super. Thanks, Brett. I think we will pursue you a bit on the podcasting side, just because I think whilst increasingly people are using podcasting, I think we're still at a point where we can share knowledge a bit more about how it works and what kind of feedback you get and what you learn from the process. But let's start with the research, if I can. So first off, I'm just really intrigued about, if I can, we're going to take questions, and I'll remind everyone that this is a recorded session. So if you have a question, do raise your hand. But I'm going to, of course, abuse chair's privilege and ask a question to start off with. And my question is, over time, I appreciate one of the challenges of the research that you're doing is that, you have to go through these different stories and discern, what's, you're doing the work of a historian, or you're relying on the work of a historian, all the challenges there. How is the use of poisons justified? Because this speaks to the point about norms and values, or is it just often used in secret, which kind of brings us to sort of spin subjects? So I'd be interested to hear what your research has uncovered along those lines.
Yeah, so it's a two-level problem. So on one level, the further you go back, the less evidential base you're dealing with, which means the greater space for artistic interpretation and filtering. So this becomes a real problem when you're dealing particularly with primary sources which have been translated, retranslated, rediscovered, and reappear again. So very often you can't actually tell, even if you think you're dealing with a primary source, it may actually not, it's actually a transmorphed version of that, which could often bring in very subtle but quite significant changes to the meaning of text. So that's one issue, it's the historian's problem, interpreting. Likewise, because related to that is the problem that you're dealing with war, which is disinformation, deep values, which is an inherent part of conflict. And you're also dealing with often very partial accounts. And so it's the problem that at one level you can see the humanity in what you're listening to. You can feel a human's voice you're hearing and reading, but trying to contextualize those voices in their world is incredibly hard. So for example, like imagine if 400 years from now, the only data source somebody has to make sense of the world is a collection of tweets from Trump's Twitter account. That's all we have. But that is the kind of nature of it. What is interesting is the fact that as you move towards the modern, however, archaeological evidence increasingly becomes, you can start using that to line certain things up. But yes, chemical weapons, certainly in poisoning and water supplies, you see discussed in moral terms, but you also see other practices discussed in moral terms as well. And so I don't necessarily think there was ever something particularly special about these weapons, normatively speaking, up until the modern era. I think the prohibition norm is quite a modern thing. But you can certainly find examples of people saying these things are particularly vicious or particularly horrible. So that's one aspect. And of course, who's they as well? So very often you're dealing with quite isolated groups of civilizations and cultures who may have there was no collective view, as it were. So yes. Yes, and also, of course, very often you're not we're looking at evidence in peace treaties. The main ones are peace treaties, stratagems, general chroniclers who just make stuff up all the time. So, for example, one of the stories I looked at was all about how they used flaming pitch to poison the water supply to make it taste really bad. But you read the rest of the work by that scholar, he's talking about flaming pitch a lot. It's definitely, for me, it looks like a kind of rhetorical trope, it's just a meta. He likes using the idea of the flaming pitch. It's like a metaphor, But if you just take one paragraph he's written, it looks like he's making an empirical claim about what happened. But you take his book in its fullness, he might be just, it was him spinning a yarn and trying to make it sound. So yes, there's all the historian stuff, and I'm not a historian, so I'm really enjoying it. But luckily there's other people that go ahead of me who have attempted to handle the primary sources. So yeah, but that's, yeah, so it's, yeah.
So methodologically speaking, you're bringing together this collection of existing work. In terms of that shift that you're talking about, where it seems, or maybe you dispute the existence of that shift, where chemical weapons feel like they're distasteful. Is there a theory in the literature as to why that's the case?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a bit of a Nietzschean here, so it's like, it's just the evolution of values and morals. And like the thing to remember is that, much of our discussion of this ancient norm predates the concept of chemical or biological, let alone the concept of biological weapon or chemical weapon. So the category, there's the idea of a categorical prohibition, for example, which is how most people think about chemical and biological weapons. These things are prohibited. That was only possible in the 20th century because we didn't have those categories before. So, for example, the distinction between a chemical weapon and explosives, which is something that's pretty central to today's understanding of weapon prohibitions. If you look at the Taoist alchemists who were making fireworks and smoke bombs, they wouldn't have distinguished between a chemical or explosive weapon because they were doing something else. And so, yes, a lot of the basic conceptual building blocks we have so we can talk in a sensible way about a prohibition weren't there. And so, for example, we think about disease. We had no understanding of disease mechanism until maybe the 18th century. And so certain practices were talked about as being good or bad, but they certainly were ever brought together under one banner, which is what this show does, So we kind of trace these often disparating roots back into history.
Wonderful. Sorry, I can see Brian's hand up. Brian's been waiting very patiently. Apologies. Brian, did you want to jump in?
Great. Thanks for that, Brett.
Hey,
I suppose, I mean, one of the things that the spin network is interested in is ignorance, and I suppose the things we aren't looking at. And I guess the danger of writing any kind of history is kind of looking for what's there, right? And then telling that story like what had happened or what records do we have, and so the history you gave us, of course, is a history of use or something like that, right? In terms of like here's where the action is.
Yes.
But then in thinking about these issues about the norm and about, let's say, within, I don't know, whatever, Western European traditions, the idea that poisons, there might be something a little wrong with these. We don't know quite what they are in the modern way.
Yeah.
We would talk about them, but somehow over time, in various ways they've been seen as problematic. So, I guess I'm wondering, I mean, how do you think about what isn't happening? How can you think about telling about the history of what isn't being talked about?
Yeah.
It's just all these absences issues, which you've written about before, right? But I'm curious within the context of then this kind of podcast format where you're kind of engaging. How do you talk about like what hasn't taken place?
So partly what I do at the moment is I start my story as almost, this is what the mainstream basic timeline of this history is in most history textbooks. And you start there, and you first of all show that most of the ones that have got into the history have often done so by completely random processes, because the reason they're in the history isn't because they're particularly convincing. Often there's next to no empirical evidence. It's just because often the story is too good to die. So in part you start with that. You say, look, the history is constructed, and you can still use that as waypoints to kind of as an initial sketch of what the kind of mainstream understanding of an issue is. Most of the time, what I do then is look for practices which may be associated with that history, and then take a deeper dive into those practices. So, for example, well poisoning, for some reason, for certain reasons, water poisoning is often seen as not necessarily chemical warfare or biological warfare, because it's designed to prevent people accessing water. And so often that's kind of written out of the histories of biological and chemical warfare. So that's interesting. Then you can you can kind of bring things into that history which seem to have been marginalized for whatever contemporary reason. The other thing that I think is interesting is there's also this history of the norm of chemical weapons and warfare as well, or the norms which seem to have an historical relationship with our modern understandings. And what I found most surprising is the fact that often we paint the history as if these things were like there's always a consensus in history, but of course there wasn't. So, and what I find is quite interesting is, particularly as you get towards the era where we've got more written evidence, is the fact it's the processes of contention that are also really interesting. So the fact that there is people talking about whether these things are right or wrong, or there's people saying, you know, so that is that process of trying to build a norm, not trying to build a norm in a kind of you know, liberal progress towards enlightenment way, but just that process of interpretation argument is also something which is there if you look for it. So it's not just tracing the kind of black box of a norm through history, it's looking how that box is being built in different periods. And that's, so partly it's, as you say, trying to look at events and trying to find new examples and that might help us understand that evolution. But partly it's looking at the evolution of the interpretation of those things as well in different societies. So it's like kind of two-level thing. If that speaks to that problem.
Do you want to follow up, Brian, or shall I ask some questions about podcasting?
No, you go ahead. I might have some questions later. But...
That's right. And if, by the way, again, if anyone else has a question, do put your hand up, or drop it in the chat, and I can repeat it for you. So I maybe we can circle back to the question of secrecy and ignorance, but
sure.
Before we run out of time, I thought it would be really valuable to try and capture some of your experiences and learning around podcasting. Although I've just noticed that Manjeet now has put her hand up, so I'm going to hold my question just to allow Manjeet to ask hers.
Okay, sure.
Sorry about that. Thanks. Yeah, no, thank you. That was an absolutely fascinating talk. And I'm just really curious to know how you got into this research.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and then just to go back to the ancients, it does remind me that Socrates was killed with the poison. So
exactly right.
Yeah. But yeah, that's all. It's a very simple question.
Yeah. So I got into this because I was reading a lot of histories anyway, because it was like tangentially related to work. So it could be justified as work, right? So it's fun, but it's work. And so then I was like, well, if I'm reading these things anyway, and I've decided to systematically read everything, I may as well make notes. And if I'm going to make notes, I may as well get feedback from people on my understanding. So that's basically what it came from, this idea of, if I'm going to build a history. So behind this project is me building a historical timeline and also a map of all major reference works on the subject. So that's the process that I'm building an archive and a timeline behind the scenes. That's what I'm doing. And this is kind of it's good. It keeps me motivated because I get feedback. Feedback's nice. It keeps me honest because it means that I get the critical feedback from people on what I'm doing, and they email and say that, you know, that's not right, that's wrong, or whatever. It's great. And also it brings me into contact with a really disparate field of experts, not just within my kind of home community, but also historians. So for example, that history of the chemical warfare in Jura Europus, I had like a wonderful 2-hour discussion with the author who did the archaeology behind that paper. And I never would have, you know, just reading the textbooks rather than actually trying to write the histories, it forces you to take that deep dive. Likewise with Adrienne Mayer, who's written the history of chemical weapons in the ancient world. Like, she's amazing. So if you speak to her, and because of this work, you know, I've had interactions with her, and she sent me advanced copies of her book and those sorts of things. And so it's all part of a practice of research, I guess. That's what the show is. It's all linked to that. It's not just a way of transmitting. It's just part of that, of a iterative thing.
Could I ask a very quick follow-up question?
Sure.
Which is, are you looking at this in other parts of the world as well?
Yes. So as I've addressed it this week. So the big problem is, as always, like the histories are civilization centric, in the sense of you tend to focus on city-state civilizations, and everything else that's happening, which encompasses most populations in those historical period, are dealt with as like a side note. It's like, oh yeah, when people were living in South America during this period doing their thing, which is like, so there's a civilization or states-based civilization centrism to the histories, and also a Eurasian centrism. And so I've started with that assumption. So what I try and do is what small references there are is to try and open up from those, because often then you can speak to scholars and specialists who know. But yes, that work is harder work, because you then have to build from scratch very often, or identify people who are not working or researching in English, and then. But that's all part of it. So, for example, I know in China there is a huge history of use of chemical weapons in particular, and I'm still trying to build the links through to Chinese scholars so that I can then transpose that across. Do you know what I mean? Like, so but yes, that's part of it. That's part of the game, I guess.
Super. Thank you so much. Then with the sort of 5 minutes or so we've got remaining, unless someone else would like to ask a question, could you talk us through the experience of podcasting and what you feel it gives you an audience, but even just the sort of where you got, what surprised you about the experience, what lessons you might impart to academics who haven't perhaps tried that approach yet?
Yeah. Well, first things first is do it on your own terms. So don't try and do it for the university or anything like that. Just set it up yourself, because then you've not got to worry about performing, and you've not got to worry about I find it's easier in terms of things like editing and not having to deal with university infrastructure. So you just do it and it's yours. And also it means then, I think, yeah, but so that's one basic thing is my suggestion is to do it independently. Don't take money, just do it as a side project. The other one is, so this is why I wouldn't have things like sponsorship or anything like that. Not that that's a problem at the moment with my 8 listeners, but I wouldn't do that, because it just makes things more complicated. If it's better, I think, just having it as a thing you do rather than something you're paid for. Or the main thing is you can get the basics of editing and distribution very, very quickly in like a couple of days. But perfection is a lot harder to achieve with things like editing. So don't aim for it. Just make sure it's basically listenable. Do a soft launch so that people in your close community who are willing to listen to it can give you feedback on basic editing. But yeah, so I think most of the software you can use, like Audacity, is what I use for voice editing. Is free and very straightforward to use once you do it. Except the fact that editing takes a lot longer than recording. If you want to get a finished product which is listenable and of reasonable quality. Yeah, and also I think for me the big thing was early on identifying who my main target community was and speaking to them via Twitter in my case, and asking them what they wanted, what they was interested in. I got people to make suggestions for the podcast show name, and that from the outset got maybe a dozen or so people who were regularly emailing me about the show. And I think that's really, really important if you have a community to serve in your head. I think that really helps you. When the strange thing is I found is initially I thought I'd maybe get a dozen listeners each week, but actually lots of other people just in a wide range of areas have found it interesting. So now have become kind of regular listeners. So yeah, but having that main audience, for me at least, I think helped me conceptualize what it was for and just relax then and do what I wanted to do.
So we're going to see you on Instagram next or something. No, only teasing.
Yeah, I am definitely. Yeah, I can't. I'm a Twitter addict, so that's been my main. That's it's almost exclusively my only way of doing it. The other thing I can recommend as well is early on I reached out to a few people doing history podcasts in the area, and said, "Oh, can I come on the show and talk about chemical weapons with you?" And that was good for people finding out about my show, but working with them and watching how they did interviews and watching what software they used was also a really quick way of getting the basics. So I would definitely recommend that as well.
And Brett, Manjeet has just reminded me to ask if there's a link to
I'm going to put it in the chat now.
Thank you very much. And we'll make sure that when we circulate the recording, that we'll link to your, is it a website based or is it on?
It's everywhere. It's everywhere now.
It's
Yeah,
okay. Very good.
I host it via Podbean, which basically means you have a website for it, but then you can find it on any player. It's on there now. Just search Poisons and Pestilence. I'm going to put you a link now.
Thanks, Brett.
Here we go.
Well,
Here's the link.
if there aren't any more questions, this brings us neatly on time. So thank you so much. As always, if you have any follow-up questions or comments or anything, you can either forward those on to us, the SPIN or SWDTP, or contact Brett directly. And once again, this recording will go onto the SWDTP website and then circulated through the SPIN media landscape, if you will. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope you join us for our next event, which I believe is Violent Ignorances, a book discussion with Hannah Jones, which I think is coming next month, but more information to come on that. All right, thanks everyone for joining us.
Thanks ever so much. The link is now up on the chat as well.
Super.
Yes, thank you very much. It was really great. Thanks.
Take care, guys.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye, guys.
Bye.